Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your hosts Sam Foote.
And Alan Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Microsoft 365 focused IT security professionals. It's episode 9 of season 4. Alan and I had a discussion around Microsoft DevBox recently. It's an Azure service to quickly spin up and manage development environments in the cloud. Here are a few things that we covered: what DevBoxes can be used for, how you can manage them, how DevBoxes can streamline your development workflow, and what are the costs associated with running DevBoxes. We've noticed a large number of you aren't subscribed. If you do enjoy our podcasts, please do consider subscribing. It would mean a lot for for you to show your support to the show. It's a really great episode, so let's get started. Hey Alan, how are you doing?
Hey Sam, not doing too bad. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, really good. It's summer. We had a bit of sun this week, which was nice for our very rainy start to August that we had. So yeah, it's feeling a lot more summery here in the UK.
Yeah, definitely. This week's been a lot better.
Yeah,
I've been off and I so it's been a nice week off. Previous week was terrible.
Weather-wise, hopefully.
Yes. Well, yeah.
Yeah, you picked a great week, to be totally honest with you. So Alan, DevBox, should we jump into it?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so should we start with sort of, why would you need a development environment in the cloud?
Yeah, so it's probably worth starting from sort of how software is developed, and the sort of software and third-party systems that you might need. So if you're a developer, you may have things like an integrated development environment. Think Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, and then you'd obviously have the code that you would write for your application. Maybe as example that we use like a web application developer or something like that. You might have your integrated development environment. You might have a database that you need to run. You might also have all of the other frameworks, SDKs that you need to actually develop that software. And what can happen is just to get that software installed can take up a lot of space on your machine. It can also take a lot of memory, so RAM inside of your machine to run as well. That's one part. You're maybe constrained by local resources. Maybe you've got a thin and light laptop. Maybe you don't have oodles of RAM and CPU performance. Also, the configuration of all of those tools to work together is complex. It can take with a fresh machine, it can take a few hours to get all of that, maybe even more than that if you have a complicated sort of tool chain and an application. So DevBox is hosted in a cloud service can make a lot of sense. There's sort of infinitely more compute there. There's larger instances that you can sort of access remote into. You can, it's a virtualization technology. So snapshotting, restoring, modifying, rebuilding is all possible. Now that's all possible locally as well. You can run your development environments in, say, Hyper-V, and virtualize them so that you can get that snapshotting and everything that you need there. What in some organizations as well, it may be that you want to save the time in each member of the team building their own development environments. Having a standardized sort of image for your development environment can be really advantageous. Let's say that a new team member joins the organization. One part of their sort of onboarding process is to get their development environment set up. It maybe could be a brand new application that they're working on, a brand new a business that they're working with, and that can take some time. So just the learning to get all of those bits together. There could be gaps in your documentation because you don't change your laptop that often. So those kinds of challenges can be overcome with a cloud-based system.
Okay, so as well, is there some scenarios where you may be working on a couple of projects on different different languages, and they won't. Sometimes they, you know, configuring those environments have to be, you almost have to have new machines for each sort of type of build, because you don't want to contaminate or kind of contaminate, bring additional things in that maybe the general repos don't need, I guess. Is that another reason why to have something in the cloud?
Yeah, just to work through sort of a real life example of that happening in the past, as Microsoft moved from, the .NET framework over to, .NET Core, and now what we know as .NET Standard, or just .NET as it is today. Um, you may be going through a stage of porting your application from an older framework version to a newer framework version, and having both of those sort of installed and jumping between them um, can be complex. I mean, there is tooling and there's support, in some of those newer frameworks to support that, because that is a kind of a common developer scenario.
Yeah.
But you are completely right. You don't know how different SDKs, frameworks, and software are going to interact with each other, and and there's that to deal with. Another area that I've sort of missed, I think, as well, is that having a separate machine to develop on, you can have a very different security policy applied to that machine, right? We kind of know that developers need local admin, right, because of all the various amounts of software that they need to install, and even when they run certain SDKs and frameworks, they need to have admin privileges to do that. So developers can be, on a security lens, developers can be like a really sort of high profile target, because they work with a lot of intellectual property, and also they generally tend to have admin sort of level permissions to their boxes as well. So they're installing loads of different software, and that is when threat vulnerability management then comes into it. Are all those frameworks and SDKs being patched regularly with their cycles and all kept up to date, and X, Y, and Z? So you're sort of shifting, that machine into the cloud. I mean, ultimately, you don't take away that requirement to have admin privileges, but for instance, where developers read their email is a completely segregated system to where they actually do their development. So you get that there is an element of isolation there as well. On the basic scenario, sort of to explain it, basically you're remote desktoping into another machine, so that there is still a way that if somebody had access to your machine, that they could watch what you were doing and that side of things, but it is a completely isolated environment from your local machine.
Yeah, it would just be reducing risk there, because like you said, there's still a method to get there from an attack path perspective, but we're just reducing or making it more difficult to get to that point. And as you said, compromising that machine might not then compromise, the internet, the IP and things like that. It's on another machine, and
So,
and
it might be from a sort of a IP loss perspective and a data loss, prevention perspective. It might be that you would, disable copy and paste in and out of the dev box, right, to start to protect against, unintentional data leakage, for insider risk, right? There's other, protection mechanisms there as well to have that completely isolated environment.
Yeah, absolutely, and what network it's coming out from and things like that, to make sure it's like an internal network rather than big, because we're hybrid working now, and I think developers were kind of already doing that kind of most of the time, I think. Anyway, so yeah, it just moves. Yeah, there's different angles there, and like you said, being in the cloud means you've got technically as much resource as you need to use for what you need, providing you're willing to pay for it. So yeah, you don't have to or pay up front for the compute. Maybe if you've got like servers and stuff like that, you need to buy on prem. So okay, so Sam, what is DevBox?
Okay, so DevBox, in a real, a very sort of basic lens, is a virtual machine that is running in Azure that you can remote into. Um, and I'll talk more about management later on. But effectively, a developer, instead of running all of that, all of those pieces of software, builds X, Y, and Z on their local machine, they would remote into a machine inside of Azure. That does require them to be online at all times because they need an active internet connection to do that, remoting into that environment. But what DevBox really gives you, because in theory you could just create a virtual machine in Azure, right? And RDP, remote desktop into that machine in a very simple scenario. But what DevBox really does is it sort of layers on building SKUs, cost control, and sort of out of the box configurations with different images and pooling of dev boxes. So it's effectively like a management layer on top of that. And there is some differences with the pricing as well. But essentially it allows platform engineers to build sort of the organization policies, network configurations and security settings. It also allows administrators of the projects, the development projects, to sort of come in, look at cost control, the development experience, and to build that project structures out. And then from a developer perspective, they get the ability to just double click on a box, log into it, and start working. If it's a fresh box, it can be pre-configured, sort of out of the box for them.
Okay, cool. So kind of sounds a little bit like Windows 365.
Yeah. So if you think Windows 365 is that exact same model really, but just for endpoints, for I'll call them standard users really. Or I suppose you can use it for privileged workstations and bits and bobs, right?
Yeah, but it's more subscription based, isn't it? And sort of one per user kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
that is true. And I suppose the SKUs that are available are very different. The starting SKUs for DevBox are probably the maximum SKUs for Windows 365, right? So so from that perspective, but yes, very similar concept. For that remote endpoint scenario.
okay, so how do you manage the boxes then, the dev boxes?
Okay, so there's a few steps that you would go through, to get a developer into a dev box. Now, it really depends on the size of your organization, because when I talk about these three different sort of roles and responsibilities that I'm going to go through, it could well be just one person as well. So it's not, absolutely massively onerous to do that. But what you do is you start off by creating a dev center. And what that really is it's a way to sort of it's sort of a container for all of the elements of DevBox. So when you want to go and manage your DevBoxes, you go into the Dev Center in the Azure portal. You would configure the network connection, so how the machine communicates, to and from the internet effectively, and other potential resources in Azure. You would create a DevBox definition. So that is sort of defining the SKUs, the image that's going to be deployed onto that box as well. So you create these definition files, and then what you then do is you create a DevBox project, and that might also represent your actual project inside your organization. So it could well be that for a given development project, you might have multiple dev boxes, maybe for different people. Maybe you might have different dev boxes for different parts of your application. Maybe your application, some of your engineers work on, the web application. Some people work on the mobile applications. Other people work on the marketing website, and other people work on the the retail store. There may be different projects in sort of your overall business. Now, these types of tasks are really a platform engineer's role. So platform engineering is really there to help manage the infrastructure and the configurations of machines in the cloud. Now, the massive benefit for platform engineers is that this is like a management layer for them. They're not deploying, as we've spoken about before, but they're not deploying virtual machines. Managing access into it. Maybe setting up VPNs or port forwarding or peering, and then installing all the tool chains and bits and bobs like that. This is really wrapping all of that experience up into a service. There's also sort of organizational policies that go in place there, and security settings that can be applied to these virtual machines as they are actually deployed. Once you've created your project, you'll also create your pool of potential dev boxes. And then once you've created those, you would then provide access to the project. So there's an element of RBAC inbuilt into here so that you can enable access to certain developers and also other project admins as well, into those projects. And then really, once that pool's set up, the developers can then access, create dev boxes, spin them up, and then they can use them basically from there. So really, you've got platform engineers sort of providing DevBox and the infrastructure. You've got project admins sort of sitting in the middle there, configuring the potential projects. They've also got cost control functionality, so they can just say what SKUs can be spun up, which ones can't. And really, they can help to customize the tool sets that get deployed onto these boxes. And then the developers they don't really have to worry about any of the infrastructure or anything like that. They can just simply spin dev boxes up in line with those policies that have been defined for them.
Cool. That sounds really, really simple, doesn't it? Especially for the developers, they don't have to worry about knowing Azure, from a virtual machine perspective or anything like that. Just in effect, power them on, or get them to build, let them provision, and then use them. So
yeah, and
it's really good.
And it's probably just worth calling out is we'll talk about it more when we come to pricing. But there's built-in auto shutdown, hibernation in place here, because there is a consumption aspect pricing to DevOps. DevBox, sorry. So you can do things like schedule shutdowns in the evenings to turn those machines off. And that's all integrated into Windows as well. It pops up and says, hey, this is going to be shut down. And you can delay it actually from the box itself. So there's a lot of really powerful integrated automation there as well on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, cool. So I think these are, if I remember, these are like Windows 10, Windows 11 devices, endpoints, rather than because you want to be able to develop on them, you don't want them to be a server sort of OS kind of thing. So they can obviously be managed with Intune, but can you use custom images or settings for the box?
Yep. So you can use the sort of standard image library from Azure. You can also build your own images. So it may be that you would probably spin up a virtual machine, configure it how you wish, and then make a quick start image from it. I would have thought if you've got a singular box that's there. What's also great is that these machines have direct access to other infrastructure in Azure. Is probably worth talking about, because your development teams might run from an actual shared development database, for instance, where they can all sort of interact with it. So you've sort of got a ring fenced sort of network environment there as well. But yeah, so we've got policies, we've got management with Intune, and then we've got images and settings for the actual dev experience, sort of built in to the product.
Okay, cool. So you kind of mentioned about talking to other resources in Azure and things like that. So what networking options are supported?
Yeah, so when you basically as you set it up, you can create a network connection inside of the DevBox Center, which can be a connection into a VNet that you may control. Um, it's going to do the same thing as Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. It's going to handle your connection, broker your connection into the machine, even with that VNet peering in place. Um, and as you've sort of spoken about, Azure AD and hybrid Azure AD join within an Intune is fully supported. So you're really getting the ability to connect into that private networking that you've potentially got in Azure, to really silo these devices away. It might be that you would look to create a separate VNet potentially for just development, right? That is completely isolated. Because of the, I would say, more dangerous, day-to-day dangerous activity that's potentially happening on those dev boxes, running potentially untested non-production code. You may wish to completely segregate all of that infrastructure away from anywhere else effectively, right? So this will give you the ability to do that. These dev boxes aren't running potentially in the same networks inside your organization, on the machines next to other, end user endpoints. So that's really powerful from that perspective for isolation and segregation.
Yeah. Okay. So having the ability to potentially restrict the internet access for those devices as well, to limited to development scenarios. So you don't have to, like you said, stop email, things like that, because they're connected to a VNet that's maybe got a firewall on the end of it. Separating it so that like you said, they're running code that then can just be in that environment, and they can access all the resources directly, like they would potentially, or like the services they're building would do in Azure. So maybe if you're building, like you said, a web app, and it's talking directly to the SQL over a private endpoint, or via the VNet, they can in effect prove all that sort of stuff works as well. Not that there should be too much difference, but it's one of those extra things that you can check before doing it. Okay, so I guess they're out there. Developers are using them day in day out. Can we track their usage? Make sure they're being used. We haven't got resources sort of left powered on. I know you said there's some like auto shutdown things like that, but I guess that's if some of it's configured.
Yeah, so there's diagnostic settings built in. So there's a completely separate table. I can't remember the name of the table that's created. I think it's Dev Center Diagnostic Logs, I believe, which is completely sort of segregated. There's various different operations that are actually tracked inside of there and the results of those operations. So you could feed that into another system to monitor that day to day, to look at the access that's happening there. So you can start to feed, and you've obviously got the endpoint analytics that you can pull from those boxes as well. So it really gives you a, you know, as we've spoken about, you can potentially isolate that environment, pull the logs from it, and really see what's happening, in and out of that environment, sort of, it's in near real time, basically. So yeah, that is supported out of the box, because these machines, that they could have your most sensitive intellectual property on them, right? They are. It's sometimes scary the amount of value that are placed on these workstations, right? So having that visibility and that segregated access is really powerful.
Yeah, well, as you said, the intellectual property being stolen, things like that is one thing, but also if we think about supply chain attacks, just a little bit of malicious code just dropping itself in there, and you not noticing, seeing those kind of things happening on those boxes. I mean, that is, I guess, say worst case scenarios here of that happening, but we've seen it in the world. Things like SolarWinds, things like that, where it's been put into the software. So it's one thing to sort of keep it back of minds and things like that. But yeah, okay. So we kind of talked about it a little bit, but how much does DevBox cost? What's the pricing sort of mechanisms?
Okay, so I think I will probably start with the SKUs really, and just explain sort of how the sort of level that they start at. So the worst SKU, I'm using air quotes that you can't see. It's 8 virtual CPU cores, 32 gigabytes of RAM, and 256 gig of storage is the worst SKU. The best SKU is 32 virtual CPU cores, 128 gigabytes of RAM, and 2 terabytes worth of storage.
Wow.
So we're really talking about very high end, potential resources. Now, I don't know of, let's say, a laptop that has 32 CPU cores. There must be. Maybe there's workstation laptops that I don't know about. I'm guessing there is. They're probably pretty
Gonna be heavy.
Not very portable for Alan on the train. Yes, Alan. So really, you've got the flexibility of being able to, sort of set your SKU for your, in your DevBox definition, you'll set your SKU to what it is that you want to run, your development environments from. Some people may decide to run their development environments at a lower SKU to see what potential performance bottlenecks or impacts there are potentially. So there's different strategies like that. So there's a range anywhere from 8, 16, 32 virtual cores, from 32 gig of RAM up to 128 gigabytes of RAM. There's absolutely plenty of performance there, and I think it's probably worth noting that different projects with different roles can have different SKUs depending on what they need. It may be that one of your applications is requires huge amounts of memory, as an example. Others may be more CPU bound. So there's things to think about and to change there.
Okay, just before you go on, so it's not so Microsoft has specified SKUs that you're allowed to use rather than it being any type of VM on Azure.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so it does definitely kind of sound like AVD, where they're specifying the SKUs that you're allowed to use. The difference is, like you said, it's, well, I guess we'll talk about it in a minute, but with Windows 365, you buy it as a subscription, so it's paid for in effect monthly. So how do you pay for these ones? Is it the same thing?
Probably one thing to call out, actually, which is slightly different with the SKUs as well, is you can't mix and match virtual CPUs and memory and storage. Okay, so if you have 8 virtual CPU cores, you always have 32 gig of RAM. The only difference between the SKUs is the storage. 16 virtual CPUs is 64 gigabytes of RAM, and the only difference is the storage. And then 32 virtual CPUs is 128 gigabytes of RAM. So, like in Windows 365, you can really tune, I want more cores, less RAM. Can't you do it in that one? You can do that.
There's a little bit, yeah. It's still a little bit sort of rigid. There is more flexibility, but
yeah.
So you're kind of saying there's three CPU and RAM combinations, and then it's disk space changes.
Yes.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, but like you mentioned, no picking of the actual SKU in Azure or anything like that. That's all handled Microsoft side.
Yeah.
And the actual pricing is interesting because it's like a capped consumption pricing model. So I'll use the quotes lowest SKU as the example. So 8 virtual cores, 32 gig of RAM, and 256 gigabytes of storage. Now, the hourly compute on that box is, I'll do it in dollars, $1.69. Okay. The monthly storage cost is $21.47 for the 256 gigabytes of storage. Okay. But I'll ignore that because it's that's obviously needs to be factored into your pricing, but that's not what affects this consumption limit pricing. Now, what's interesting is the maximum price for that SKU per month is $156. Okay. And what happens is once you've used it for a certain amount of once you get to, let me just work that out. I'm just going to fire up my calculator because I'm
It's
bad at
156
maths.
hours or something, isn't it?
Divided by $1.69. 92 hours.
Okay.
Right? So once you get to 92 hours, you're then capped at the $156 price point. Okay. So if I divide 92 by 4.4 for the average number of weeks in a month, you get to basically 21 hours a week. So if you were to use it, say 35 hours a week, then anything over 21 hours a week is just going to be, it's not free because you've already paid for it, but it's going to be capped at that rate. So what this is, I think this is beneficial for both sort of ends of the extreme. People that use these machines 24/7, right? It's going to be great because they are capped at $156, right? And $156 for 8 virtual CPU cores and 32 gig of RAM is a pretty good deal because these are Windows 10, Windows 11 endpoints. It's probably should also be known that you need to provide, that user needs to be licensed for the operating system. That's the same as Windows 365, right? You need to be licensed.
Correct.
For that. So, operating system is a separate layer on top of this. We're just talking about compute at this point. So you're looking at a capped, what was it, 92 hours of compute. But if you don't use it for 92 hours, right? There's potential for certain developer boxes to only be used in scenarios. You might have a QA box that you run up that you test on. Maybe you download your production releases on it and you run through a test suite. You boot it up potentially and maybe you go through that process manually. Maybe you can't fully CI/CD that testing process. I'm just using some examples, but basically there is up to that 92 hours there is just a per hourly compute cost for that infrastructure.
Okay, so when this was in preview, I think when we first looked at these, we were worried about it being, that the full price and there not being a cap. We couldn't quite understand, in some sense, what their usage was. I think when we were first looking at why, because it's quite, it seemed quite expensive, I think. But with that cap, it kind of seems quite nice again, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's because basically it gives you the best of both worlds. Because if you do use it for, say, an unlimited amount, you can't use it for an unlimited amount because only a certain number of hours in a month, right? So it's, in theory, it's capped by time. But if you do use it a lot, I don't really think $156 for that instance is potentially that expensive. I mean, you could always make the argument of capexing a laptop and then using it for 4 years, right? But an 8 CPU core 32 gig of RAM machine is what, $2,500, $2,000, maybe more than that if you're going workstation.
Yeah, and it's not just that though, is it? It's the what happens if it breaks. Exactly. Scenarios, things like that. You got to buy another one to replace it. We've got the downtime.
Probably worth calling out that you can, that you can connect to it with a browser, just like Windows. You can connect to Windows 365, both AVD and Windows 365. Yeah, you can do those both. It's all the same thing. It's not the same thing, but it is the same thing. So there is that business continuity perspective as well, right? Laptop dies, in theory, you could connect to it from an iPad. You could connect to it from another, spare on the shelf inventory laptop without having to rebuild everything. There's that part of it. Then just probably worth calling out the licensing. So you're looking at F3, E3, A3, and above, E5, A5 licensing, business premium, and I'm not sure what else there would be, but effectively where you get that, is it Windows Enterprise license? Is that what the benefit's called in those SKUs?
Windows
Yeah,
Enterprise or Windows for Business if you're using the business premium side of ones.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
To give you a subscription SKU to give you in effect it's still around, but the VDA license in effect to allow you to remote onto another machine from an RDS perspective.
yeah, exactly. So and it will stop infighting in the organization where certain people have better laptops than other people. Hey, Alan, right? It's just everybody's got the same, right? It's easy peasy at that point. So definitely a more modern, I would say, advanced development, methodology and system, but it's definitely a very modern and well thought out approach to those potentially sensitive workstations.
Yeah, it definitely sounds good. I mean, when we first seen it, like we said, it seemed from a management perspective seemed really good. Pricing seemed a little bit high, but as you just said, now it seems really good now. And it's probably worth calling out that the broker part of it is in effect Azure Virtual Desktop, AVD, Windows 365. They're all using that same technology, same brokers, because it just works, doesn't it? So why rebuild something different? Just you jump on the same service.
Yeah, and the underlying tech might be the same, but the management planes are very different to all of them, right? They're very specifically focused into their actual use cases. It's I should probably just call out the maximum SKU monthly cost, because that's also sometimes exciting as well. So 32 virtual CPU cores, 128 gigabytes of RAM, 2 terabytes of storage. Your monthly storage cost is $171 for 2 terabytes of, I assume, premium SSD. And your hourly compute is $6.74, capped at $710 a month. So if you have a development need that requires 32 virtual cores and 128 gig of RAM, there's a SKU there for you as well. Slightly eye-watering at that price, but fingers crossed you're not running it.
Can you imagine the cost of a physical device though? With that,
well, that's and that's it. What is that? Is that Mac Studio? Probably, I would have thought. And other probably high-end workstations, right? And you're probably talking. I don't know actually. I don't know at those sort of crazy high numbers what the ROI is on both sides, right? It might be actually the more RAM you put in per gigabyte, it becomes cheaper, and I don't know. So
yeah, I guess on some of those boxes though, if we're thinking it's going to be more of a desktop than a laptop, then you're also stopping yourself from being mobile. I mean, yes, you can remote that machine, but then like you said, you've got to put in VPNs and everything to jump onto it, all the software to jump onto it at least.
Yeah, and it's your responsibility, like all of the infrastructure and all the layers in between. This is Microsoft providing it to you, right, as a service. So it's for them to worry about the uptime of it.
Okay, cool. So is there anything else you can think of around dev boxes? More dev box?
No, I think it's going to be, up to an organization to work out, the ROI, the risk reduction potentially, the reduction in management and overhead, whether it's going to be worth it for them. I think for the repeatable, environments and development experience, I think get massive savings there just straight away, and being able to change your SKUs and decide your performance is pretty powerful.
Well, I guess as well, if anybody wanted to try it out, it's relatively simple. Not necessarily, well, it is simple to kind of set up, but there's no upfront cost to get it set up. You can start using it and paying that $1 an hour. Turn it on, see, set up all the configuration, and then get a dev or get someone to like jump onto a box, see what it's like, see what like your worst case is $156 for one box if it ran for a month.
Yeah, you
That's
just put the auto
nice
stop
to
on it, wouldn't you?
try.
And you'd shut it down, right? Just like you deallocate a virtual machine. It's the same,
Yeah,
concept there. So
yeah,
yeah, like you said,
exactly, and
very low barrier to entry, like for sure, definitely.
yeah, cool. Okay, so it's probably worth, because we did say around this that it's very similar to AVD and Windows 365. So if you're sort of interested in some of those sort of that technology, it's probably worth jumping back to our season 3 episode 20, where we did a AVD versus or AVD and Windows 365 comparison. Now thinking we should add DevBox into that mix as well.
Yeah, to be fair, yeah. Well, actually, you could say that AVD would be quite a good other technology to compare this against, really, right? Because if you do need SKU flexibility and
Yeah,
images, AVD can also do quite a lot of that, can't it? If you're
yeah, it
happy to
can, but
provision that.
yeah, I think it's a blend of the two, though. I
Yes.
think it's kind of the taking 60-80% of the management away from you, but giving you the flexibility to be consumption. I think it's
Yes.
that sort of mix. So
Yeah.
I think it's like the happy place for for this scenario, at least.
Is it the Goldilocks? Is it they're just
For
right for
developers, yes. For developers, yes. Because you haven't got to manage the hosts and everything in AVD,
Exactly.
and
Yeah,
you
I
don't have
completely
to
agree.
give someone a SKU that's only one per. Well, you can get more than one per user, but they have to have different SKUs in effect, and they have to pay. You have to pay 1 month at a time, 3 months at a time. It's not just like you said, turn off, turn on,
Yeah,
kind of
exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
So,
So Alan, it's your episode next. What are you going to be covering?
so I'm going to cover what Microsoft recently announced with the rebrand of Microsoft Entra, or Microsoft or Azure AD being now called Microsoft Entra ID. As part of that coming out, that announcement, they announced the Microsoft Entra Global Secure Access, which is quite interesting about how you can secure your endpoints and how they access the internet wherever they are. So it's kind of similar to a secure web sort of gateway kind of thing. So I'm looking at it. It's very new to me because it's just come out. But I've been setting it up, and yeah, we'll talk about it.
Okay, great. Yeah, sounds really good, Alan.
So, did you enjoy this episode? If so, please do consider leaving us a review on Apple or Spotify. This really helps us to reach more people like you. If you have any specific feedback or suggestions, we have a link in our show notes to get in contact with us.
Yeah, and if you've made it this far, thanks very much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, thanks for listening. See ya.